Thank you everyone today for joining our webinar today on building a stronger paraeducator workforce model to strengthen classrooms. We're here with Corey Galano, and I'll give him a chance to introduce himself in a second. As you can see, we're both sporting matching purple practice shirts, which is super exciting. And yeah, today we really want to focus the conversation on how we can best support our paraeducator population, both free service and also in district, to really sort of help make an impact for students and the educator community as a whole. Corey, why don't we just start with sort of letting you introduce yourself, and then we can sort of dive into the conversation.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Vinay. And really happy to be here with you all today on a nice midsummer webinar that we're having. Yep. I'm Corey Galano. I run the Paraeducator program here on the Praxis team. And I work closely with Vinay and our product team and our marketing team on making sure that we are building and promoting products that we feel help and programs that help the paraeducator workforce and the districts and states that rely on this critical role in the classroom. And I've been at the Praxis team for about 5 years now.
Great. So hold on. So just want to make sure. So it looks like Suzanne is having trouble hearing us. Can others hear us okay on the call? Suzanne, it might be a speaker issue on your end. So maybe just take a quick look there and see. This looks like everyone else is able to hear. So apologies for that. So I guess, Corey, before we dive into some of the questions around sort of paraeducator and things, the paraeducator has always been sort of an important part of the school sort of fabric, or at least maybe not always, but at least since, early 2000s when the sort of concept of it really sort of became sort of enacted or supported through federal legislation. But what do you think is the driver, maybe why this conversation is becoming so timely today around and sort of the role they play in the district, and also like ways in which we can support?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think for one, the role of the paraeducator is getting some much overdue recognition for all that they do in the classroom. I think that's a really big piece of it. I also think that the role of the paraeducator, especially in special education classrooms and with high needs students, has been growing and taking on more responsibility. And I think also it's been really interesting to see the evolution of where states and districts are recruiting their paras from. I think that there's a wider breadth of areas that we can recruit paras from as opposed to teachers. And so I think that also has a lot to do with it as well.
Great. And given conversations you're having, where do you hear the biggest challenges are around sort of the recruitment and sort of the support of paras in the classroom?
Yeah, the recruitment's an interesting one. It's been, as I mentioned, really exciting to see from our vantage point on the Praxis team, the creative ways that districts are getting paras into these critical roles. So the three that you hear most often are recruiting from high school CTE programs, which I'd love to talk more about, adult education programs, and community college programs as well. Those are the three that at least I hear most often from districts that I work with. So on the recruiting side, I think there are different challenges that come with each of those three paths, but regardless of how they get into the classroom, I think the challenge we hear most often from our districts that we support are these paras were not ready for the speed and the real day-to-day of a classroom just because they passed the standard of getting a license to be a paraeducator. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're prepared for what day one actually looks like. And so we hear a lot of districts that have a very high turnover for paraeducators because paras are not trained or ready for the real classroom environment. And so maybe they show up for a week and then they don't show up again, or they show up and they're in a special education classroom and there's a challenge on one of their first couple weeks that they were not ready or weren't expecting, and it just is not for them. And I think that's the challenge. I think that's also the opportunity where districts and we try to support paras in preparing for that classroom environment, not just preparing for the content knowledge in math and reading and writing.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I mean, and I think maybe love to maybe hear from you to touch on. You and I have talked about this before, sort of maybe the changing face or the changing profile of what a typical paraeducator sort of looks like. I know historically it was oftentimes like we talked about, like, the second income person in a household, or maybe they had like a personal connection to that district. Maybe a child was enrolled in that district or whatever it might be. But that's also changing, right? It's sort of where sort of the type of candidate that's showing up oftentimes could be very different today than it was even 10 or 15 years ago. Does that resonate with you? Or
Definitely. And I think the piece that is the same. I'll start there and then I'll go
yeah,
into I think what's
that'd be
shifting.
helpful.
I think the really great part about what's remaining from that prior like environment that you mentioned is that the paraeducators are still very close to the community that they are serving in as paraeducators. I think that part has remained the same. A lot of the paraeducators that we support, they are taking the test in a district building that they will then be a paraeducator in. So they are very deeply ingrained within the district that they are either living in or living close to. And I think that is something we should not ignore and we should look to support further, just the community ties that a lot of these paraeducators have. And then, yeah, in terms of the profile, I think it depends on the recruitment path that the district is taking. A high school CTE program, that is, if we get a credential or a license for a high school senior, that allows them to go right back into the school as in gainful employment in the classroom as a paraeducator. And in some cases, they will go eventually on a para to teacher track, or maybe they are just a paraeducator for 2 or 3 years and then they move on to a different career path. But serving, I know a lot of districts that would love to have 2 or 3 years of a really strong paraeducator, even if they don't remain in the classroom.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely you already touched on it briefly, and I think we'll go deeper in it later in the conversation. But there's definitely sort of this, you know, there are a couple sort of dynamics at play here. Like, in many communities, that the K-12 building is still one of the largest employers in that community, right? And this is sort of a credible and meaningful pathway for people to sort of have gainful employment, especially amidst the larger conversation around, like, maybe it's not in the best interest for every single high school graduate to sort of pursue a 4-year college degree anymore, just because of the cost of education and the perceived ROI or value of those 4-year degrees and things like that. This really provides a real meaningful alternative for people to remain connected and remain sort of local to their own community where they grew up, if that's something they would want to do, and still sort of, but do so in a way that actually has a career path tied to it, right? Because there is optionality that sort of presents itself to this individual upon becoming a para, where that same sort of career pathing may not exist in other industries, whether it's like, quick service restaurants or other retail or other things like that, right? So there's something really interesting here that I think we could go deeper on together as a community education standpoint.
For sure, I agree. And I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole on this conversation at all. But in the age of, you hear a lot about like the shrinking entry level job area across a lot of industries. And I think it's a really interesting place where we could focus some of our efforts collectively. Like a great entry level job could be a paraeducator. Like think of all of the skills that you would learn as a paraeducator in the first 2 years post college or post high school that are translatable on a resume or will transfer into another role if you don't remain in the classroom. And then if you do enjoy your experience there are a lot of tracks within a lot of states to become a teacher or an administrator. And I think starting with the role of the paraeducator really gives you that full view of the classroom in a lot of districts.
Yeah. 100%. I actually just had a conversation yesterday with a retired superintendent in Michigan who started out as a para, which I thought was super cool. Yeah. Uh, Yeah, and then, so I'd love to sort of shift. You already talked about sort of classroom readiness as sort of this big sort of like area of need and potential opportunity, which is like a natural sort of segue into sort of the Power Pathways exam and some of the other stuff like the HLP modules that we've been developing. So maybe sort of like you can sort of introduce us to the Power Pathways exam first and the problem we were looking to solve with it. And if you don't mind, sort of maybe sort of integrating some of the context around the original Para Pro exam, where that came from, and sort of what sort of drove us to sort of reflect on that and sort of say like we need something new and we need to sort of revisit that type of assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the Para Pro assessment, which has been our paraeducator licensure assessment at ETS for over 20 years now. It was actually developed in response to the No Child Left Behind Act, which was really the introduction of federal standards for paraeducators in a lot of ways. And so ParaPro has been, I would say, the standard assessment for paraeducator licensure for over 20 years across 42 or 43 states. And over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been having ongoing conversations with our states and districts that use ParaPro. And we started to get some feedback that some of the content is a little bit long in the tooth, specifically around areas like science of reading principles, which have replaced a lot of previous standards in the reading and writing area, and also math in terms of the application skills of different mathematics concepts. And so we got a lot of feedback on the blueprint and the content that was included in the ParaPro test needing to be updated. And so we went down the path of creating a new blueprint for the Para Pathways assessment with the goal of completely replacing the ParaPro assessment. And the Para Pathways assessment uses today's federal standards for paraeducators and also uses college and career readiness standards. So it's a more modern assessment when it comes to the content. And we also took this opportunity to respond to other pieces of feedback that we had gotten. ParaPro never had the availability of a calculator. We now have an on-screen calculator for Para Pathways. We also split the test from what was previously a single combined test to 2 subtests, one for math, one for reading and writing. So that allows our paraeducators to focus their study time. It allows them to, if they have test anxiety, have a shorter time in seat if they would like to. They can still take the combined test if they would like, but we're seeing in the data that a lot of paras are opting to take a subtest and then followed immediately by another subtest, depending on how long they want in between. So that's the history of the assessment, and we've had 25 states already adopt Para Pathways. So we have a few more to go before we can officially retire ParaPro. But that is the goal, and we feel and stand behind the research and the efficacy data that went into the development of the Para Pathways test.
And from a district perspective, then, obviously we revamped the assessment. How do we help districts think about that tool as maybe the beginning of a para educator sort of development journey, as opposed to sort of just a sort of certification assessment? Because I know that's a big part of what we want to sort of help support the idea of it being a skilled profession as a para, just like we do for teachers and leaders and everyone else involved as well. What can we sort of provide to a district from a learning standpoint today around that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting and nuanced conversation, I would say, because it's in the offices of ETS. Sometimes it's easy for us to think about like, how can we support a paraeducator? And we have like a profile in our mind of what that path looks like to hiring a paraeducator at a district and what that paraeducator needs or may need. And the reality across a lot of districts, I think, is that the hiring of paraeducators is an emergency. At a lot of times throughout the year, like we needed somebody yesterday in this role, and so I think knowing that reality is a big important piece of the puzzle here. And then beyond that, I think it gets into like, what do we want to develop when it comes to paraeducator workforce? Is it just a pipeline for constantly filling these roles, knowing that we will need to refill these roles because there's going to be high turnover? Or do we want to take a little bit of a longer view and, in addition to the test, help them develop the skills that they need to be successful in the classroom, to be comfortable and confident in the classroom, and ultimately to drive the outcomes for students and teachers that they are supporting in their role as paraeducators? And maybe that's a nice segue to start talking about the high leverage practice modules, if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think sort of it's just one sort of like anecdote, and then, let's dive into that. Is, what I think one of the bigger learnings or surprises I had over this past year, I think we all had, was sort of assuming that every district or every superintendent or every HR leader like wanted to upskill their paras to become teachers, right? And we just sort of like, that's the default. Like everyone, like, yeah, of course, like you want to, unlike, and for many places, like, finding and recruiting paras is just as challenging or is just as sort of, fraught as finding teachers is. And so they're like, no, 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 like our goal isn't to upskill all of our paras. Yeah, sure, a subset of them may end up. That's not like part of our strategic sort of like plan, right? Is to create this like pathway where all of our paras become teachers. No, like we want to actually help paras become great paras, feel fulfilled at the job and continue to be paras because finding a good person who can be a great para is really hard in the district in which we currently operate. So it's like not assuming that every district has the same goals for their paras, I think was like one of the probably the most profound learnings that we had this year, right? And it sort of speaks to sort of the role. Once again, it only added to the justification for why we built high leverage practices specific to paras. Because a lot of people are like, well, why would you just not build these for teachers? You know, the ambitious paras could take those like along the way to becoming a teacher. It's like, well, because one, they're different. Like the role of the parent and the role of the teacher is different in the classroom. But two, not everybody wants their paras to like only be viewing their job as a stepping stone to becoming a teacher. There is value in sort of viewing the para educator role in and of itself as a career, in and of itself as a profession that has skills tied to it. But yeah, I would love to transition maybe that to, or maybe if you're happy to, if you want to respond to that, but then love to sort of like transition that to, okay, like what's next? You've taken the exam, you've passed. What fits now into that larger sort of like upskilling journey?
Yeah, I would only say I agree with everything you just said. It is a very specific to the district conversation for sure. I would say even at the state level, like we're working with one state right now, and for them, the paraeducator shortage is more negatively impactful than the teacher shortage. And so this is a huge, major initiative for them to develop a workforce program for paraeducators that allows them to not only hire, but also retain paras in these roles because it is very challenging for them with the number of paras that they need to hire every year. So yeah, I agree completely. And then getting into the high leverage practice modules, I would harken back to the conversations we were having with districts around the need for a new test. Even with those conversations, the feedback was, yes, great. A new assessment is needed, content refresh is needed, but also what can we do to support the skill development of paraeducators? And what the feedback that we got most often, or the information that was shared with us most often, is that there is plenty of PD out there for teachers that is built for the role of being a teacher. But there is not a lot of PD or professional development or professional training for paraeducators that is specifically built for the role of the paraeducator. A lot of times across many districts, the paraeducators are kind of thrown into teacher PD days, where a lot of that content is not geared towards their role. It is kind of just checking the box of the required training hours federally for paraeducators. And a lot of times they come out of that with not really a better understanding of what the expectations for that role are. And you can see how that picture is not ending up with a confident, skilled paraeducator that knows how they can kind of fit into the dynamic of a classroom day to day. It's not adding up to a good situation in a lot of districts. And so we looked around the room within the Praxis team across research and product, and we asked ourselves, like, what can we do to support this? And what can we do to help in this scenario? And the really cool part about working at ETS is if there's a topic when it comes to education, we probably have a ton of research about it and a ton of data that we can lean on. And so we went to our research team and we asked, like, what are the outcomes and what are the skills that a paraeducator needs to be successful in the classroom in driving those outcomes? Whether it comes to student learning or teacher happiness, like what are the skills that a para could develop to make themselves more effective in that role? And that's where the high leverage practices came in for us. And I should be clear that these are the ETS high leverage practices. If you look up high leverage practices for teachers or paraeducators, there may be other organizations that have identified different skills, but these are based on the research and the data that we have access to, what we identified as the most important skills for paraeducators. So we got to work on developing training and modules built specifically for the role of the paraeducator that we could deliver asynchronously or in a workshop format. And we released the first two modules for paraeducators in November of last year. The two topic areas, and I can put these in the chat, or maybe you can, Vinay, are creating a positive classroom climate and engaging students with subject matter. Each of those modules has 3 activities underneath, and the delivery method of that training, there are 2 methods. The first is situational judgment, kind of typical PD scenario-based questions where the paraeducator is reading through content and then presented with scenarios and asked to choose what they think is the best way to respond in that scenario. And then the second is more simulation-based training where they are working with a simulated student in the form of an AI chatbot, and they are doing things like asking probing questions and eliciting student thinking. And the feedback report that they get on the other side of that is essentially letting them know how many of the probing questions did they ask to allow for the student to really explain how they arrived at the answer. So we're really excited about the 2 that we've released so far. We're working with 3 states so far, and also a lot of districts across the country that are using the high leverage practice modules in a few different ways. I think the cleanest fit so far has been with high school CTE programs, where high school juniors and seniors are using the modules as part of a complementary piece of a curriculum at that CTE program. We've had a lot of success there. And then we're also, and teacher academies, which are kind of similar. And then we're also starting to see a lot of interest at the state level where they're looking to subsidize and build an entire paraeducator workforce development program that includes the modules, test prep, and the Para Pathways licensure test. So that's a lot of speaking for me. I'm going to pause and see if that's helpful.
I'm gonna use Eddie. Thank you for sharing a question. I'm gonna put it up on the screen now, and we can answer it together. Because I think it's what you're bringing up, Eddie, is a great question, and it sort of allows us to talk to a larger, more philosophical sort of shift at the praxis side too. So why don't I put it up and sort of Eddie's question: are the State Department of Education the departments of education are going to require both, or will they leave that decision up to the individual districts? I believe he's talking about the HLPs. So, Corey, if you wanted to answer that, and I can sort of speak a little more big picture as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I should be clear that the HLPs, the modules, are intended to be low stakes and not part of a licensure decision. Now, in terms of requiring a para to use the modules before they go into the classroom, most states and districts that we have partnered with are using both. And I think the intent is to continue to add more modules as we have more ready. We are also in the process of developing 3 additional modules, which I can share the topic areas in the chat as well. So by the end of this calendar year, or maybe in the spring of 2027, we'll have a total of 5 in the paraeducator suite of modules. And I think the intent for a lot of states and districts is to include all 5 in the path to becoming a paraeducator. Again, not with the intent of not holding back a license, but with the intent of upskilling paras at any point in their path to the classroom.
And sort of this speaks to a larger sort of, I guess maybe shift is the wrong word, but broadening of the aperture of where we believe ETS practice can play a role in the overall educator life cycle, which is increasingly building products and solutions that can be utilized not only in a high stakes environment, but also in other contexts as well, whether it's more for a voluntary or elective professional development context. Maybe it's required, but it's more so for an upskilling standpoint. I think where we get really excited about things like the HLPs is the ability to potentially use them in a place where could districts start to imagine now incremental pay bumps as a result of completing these, right? So can they create more carrots around the consumption of these as opposed to just sticks, which is like, oh, you need this in order to get the job, or this is a gating sort of use case. It's like, no. Like, let's actually like motivate people to want to consume this and want to become better and reward them for completion of those. So great question, Eddie, because I think it gives us an opportunity also to talk about that. And what you'll see is, for those of you who joined our webinar 2 weeks ago, talking about some of the new innovative products that we're doing around sort of the totality of the teacher candidate, whether it's durable skills, mindset, dispositions, Proetica. So, right, these are all sort of products that sort of have both a sort of summative / sort of like gating use case, right? Because like, especially some of that stuff is going to get likely used as a substitute or replacement to Praxis Core in the EPP context. But we also very much see those tools becoming incredibly useful from a developmental and formative standpoint for the teacher, for the educator at various points in their journey. Maybe even tying it to educator evals on an annual basis, those types of things. But doing so much more in a development with a developmental lens. And that's actually starting to get reflected in sort of the type of reporting that's going to come along with some of these newer tools around. It's not just the cut score, it's not just you pass or you fail, but it's really about, and here's what you can do to better yourself over time. Uh, so thank you for that question, Ed. We appreciate it. Uh, so I think we talked a lot about sort of what HLPs are. And because of this question, I think we've started talking through like different ways districts or other entities could use it. I think you mentioned CTE a couple of times. It feels like this is a good sort of segue into going deeper on that sort of bucket of things. So maybe give us some context around how you all are seeing that opportunity and sort of the role that para pathways and HLPs could play in that.
Yeah, I would say that I would say some high percentage, I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but a high percentage of the districts that we are working with are primarily recruiting paraeducators from high school CTE programs. Not all, but a good percentage of them. And I think that speaks to a couple of things. Gainful employment right out of high school for these paras. I think that's a very strong pull for high school students, that they will have a recognized credential and a license for gainful employment right out of high school. So I think that's a really good fit, especially with everything we talked about earlier with the shrinking entry level jobs in a lot of industries. I think it's also recognition from a lot of districts that while these students may not be lifetime educators, the opportunity to get young paraeducators into the classroom is a different feel than recruiting someone from adult education or community college programs. Not that either is better or worse than the other, but I think depending on the classroom, the profile of a paraeducator is important in terms of age. I also think that when it comes to training and developing, at times I think the path to putting someone through a training program is it's more familiar to a high school student than maybe it is to someone coming from a different profession or something or someone coming back to the workforce after, raising a family or something like that. So I think all of those are big factors in why we're seeing a lot of focus on high school CTE programs. I think it's a good thing. I think that a lot of districts are seeing success with it.
Great. And obviously that's one of the emerging trends or new areas of what we think are opportunity to help support more. What other sort of things are you seeing right now in the paraeducator sort of workforce ecosystem that you'd want to sort of share or have people know about?
Yeah, I think the topic that we're hearing a lot when we speak with districts right now is how can we help with teacher para collaboration? That is one of the hot button topics right now that many districts feel might be holding those classroom outcomes back a bit. A lot of times paras are assigned to a classroom a week or less before school starts. So there's not really a lot of time for the teacher and the paraeducator to develop that rapport or develop the ways of working within that classroom. And so that's actually one of the modules that we are in the process of developing is para-teacher collaboration. Obviously, that's going to be a two-way street. It's not going to be all on the paraeducator to figure out how to work with the teacher. That's obviously a two-way street. But at the end of the day, if as a paraeducator, you are able to go into a classroom and regardless of whether it's a special education classroom or a general education classroom, you're able to figure out what's needed from me in this environment. I think that's an important skill and we're trying to help at a very high level to help them figure that out and develop that skill. We see it as a skill. Collaboration is a soft skill regardless of what area you're talking about in education.
Yeah, no, appreciate that. And, it's funny. It's like, funny is the wrong word, but it's interesting to think about sort of the interactions that a para has on a day-to-day basis, both with the teacher, but also with students, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in many contexts, especially in the special education context, that para might be the person that a student interacts with most throughout the day, right?
Absolutely.
Especially for some of the sort of situations that have where they're like one-on-one, sort of they're dedicated basically almost full time to that individual
Yep.
student. Uh, so you can think about from the perspective of a group of people who have potential to make such an outsized impact on student outcomes, on student sort of goals. It starts to feel almost like a no-brainer that we should be figuring out ways to sort of invest in them, figuring out how to support them, help them upskill themselves so they can be successful, they can feel successful in their own careers. What what excites you most about, you know, you've been here now really owning this and driving the transformation from the legacy to Parapro to Para Pathways, now the launch of HLPs, pretty much since the beginning of this decision to sort of refresh this. You've been the person sort of driving this. What is exciting? What have you seen that excites you most about it? Like, sort of a little bit of like a best is yet to come type of sort of like orientation. Sort of what is getting you motivated? What keeps you going around this sort of challenge today?
Yeah, I think it's the shift from the constant hiring of paraeducators, expecting turnover, to really treating this as a workforce development program that starts with the paraeducator. Like if you think about, I'm excited about the idea that a paraeducator has the content knowledge and exposure to real classroom environments before they ever step foot into the classroom. Like think of the confidence that a para is able to step into that classroom after having gone through some real training that was geared specifically towards the role of the para, and think about the confidence that will give them to do their job from day one. Think about the confidence it gives them in perhaps their ability to be a full-time teacher down the line, if that's of interest and if that's a program that the district has. I just think the more that we can shift and change the paradigm to this is not just a role that needs to be filled on an annual basis by a new person, to like these paraeducators are part of the fabric of the education system, and we should be investing and invested in them. I think that's the most exciting part, and the part that I'm already seeing that shift, but that is the part that I think is most exciting.
Great. So I appreciate that. And I think it's a great sort of transition point to maybe open it up to some questions from the audience, if there are any. Sort of happy sort of to sort of field those now, but and thank you so far for your time, Corey.
Yeah, absolutely happy to be here.
Are there any questions from the crowd that we wanted to? Perfect. Can you give us a glimpse into some of the upcoming high-level practice topics and why they're especially relevant for paraeducators today? I'll put that up.
Yeah, sure can. So I mentioned one, that's the para-teacher collaboration, and the other two are assessing and responding to student learning. We know that all students, regardless of what age group, they all have different learning styles. And so the recognition of a particular student's learning style and adapting to that is going to be an important part of the paraeducator's role. And then the third one is drawing on students' experiences. And I think this is a callback to what we mentioned in terms of the paras being such a part of the fabric of the district and the community, and every district, the demographics are different, and so the paraeducator's ability to draw on whatever similar experiences they may share with students in that classroom, I think is going to be an important skill as well, or at least I think the data indicates, I should say, because we built all of this based on research and learning.
Any other questions, comments, concerns, critiques of our fashion choices?
I've had many critiques on fashion choices, mostly from my wife, Vinay.
Yeah,
So I was
exactly.
hoping not to have any of those here.
Right. Well, I guess if there's no other questions, then I'm just going to assume that's a result of the fact that Corey's an excellent communicator and has really just addressed every single aspect of the Para Pathways and HLP ecosystem for us today. I just want to start off by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Corey, for your time today. We're really excited to see the future of this entire sort of solution set grow and evolve. I very much expect that we'll probably want to do another one of these in 6 to 9 months to talk about some of the new innovations and also some of the new learnings that we've gotten from both districts, states, and even regional support centers, all of whom I think who have a vested interest in making sure paraeducators are successful in their journeys. And with
That
that,
sounds good. Happy to join anytime.
I'll let everyone else go, and thank you again.
So.